Welcome to Podcast Answers, the show where I help people start and grow their podcast, answering any podcasting questions along the way. And today we have a special episode. We are going to be chatting with Katie Fawkes from Ecamm about interviewing and interview questions and how do you get interviewers to talk. Pre-show here, I was chatting with her and just it was a great conversation. So I wanted to bring her on and talk a little bit today about how you can do this. And her and Doc Rock were talking about this on a recent episode of The Flow. And so it got me thinking, a lot of my listeners would love to hear this same conversation with Katie. So Katie, welcome to the show. Can you just talk a little bit about who you are?
Nope, absolutely not. No, just kidding. Well, I'm so delighted to be here. If you haven't met me yet, I am Katie. As Andy was saying, I work over at Ecamm, which is a live streaming and video production software that Andy is using and many people use to bring their podcasts, their shows, their videos to life and be able to do really cool things. I have a really weird background. I actually started in copywriting, so I was the person that absolutely never ever wanted to be on camera. Never ever wanted to be on camera. And now I love it. I feel like I'm probably doing these kinds of, interviews or video recordings or live streams certainly multiple times a week, many times, multiple times a day. So I do think I'm a big believer in the fact that practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and just being yourself really goes a long way in building your confidence and getting you towards your goals. And for me, it was scared to be on camera to confident on camera. So that's my short blurb on me today.
Yeah. And I know you've interviewed me for a couple different shows before. And so, yeah, I was really impressed with how I knew your story. I knew that you came from this whole idea of not being on camera to being pretty comfortable on camera. You and Doc do a show bi-weekly now. But then you also are interviewing people on other shows for Ecamm's network. And so, let's just talk a little bit today about interviewing and interview tips. So we were talking a little bit before the show about how it feels interesting when, we were talking and it felt like a conversation, but then as soon as you hit record, it almost feels like there's pressure to make the conversation flow and everything. So what's the very first tip that you'd give me as far as interviewing goes and helping keeping the conversation flowing?
Oh my gosh. Well, I would say that if you're newer to interviewing, do yourself a favor and start with friends or start with people that you can have those really great conversations with, because it will give you confidence. It'll help you to put in the reps, but it'll also help you figure out what kinds of questions really work well, what kinds of questions maybe don't, and how your audience responds. And again, if you're bringing on a friend, Andy and I know each other pretty well at this point. We're able to have good conversations. So I know that if I was the interviewer and I had a moment of panic where I, forgot a question or I was looking flustered, I know Andy would dive in and start talking or share different experience. You have someone that will cover you for that. So I would say start with people that you're really comfortable with. And then just take notes every single time you're practicing, what worked really well, what didn't work really well. There's a ton of different styles when it comes to interviewing people. So starting with getting in those reps and figuring out what works really well for you and what your audience resonates best with.
What would you say is your interview style?
Oh gosh, we were just talking about this. I am definitely the conversational style interviewer. I don't do a lot of prep work when it comes to questions. I am the person that maybe this is because A, I'm a perfectionist, and B, I come from a writing background. If I sit and write out what I want, what the perfect interview is for me, right? So I write out what all the questions are. I write out how I want it to flow, what the segments are. If I write all of that out, when it comes time to actually doing the interview, I'm so locked into those specific questions and that's my expectation for how I want the show to go. And it's never going to go like that because, you could be having a really bad day as my guest. There could be a tech challenge. I could forget the question. One of the questions could not get the kind of answer I'm looking for. So it really locks me into a way too rigid and way too tight a box, really. And so for me, I've found through experience really that if I do that, it's just not going to work out the way that I want it to. And it makes for a really unpleasant situation and experience for both me and for my guests. They can
Hmm.
tell that I'm like really trying to focus on these specific questions. If they get off track, I'm like clearly looking at the questions. I'm clearly looking at the clock. So I don't. I do a lot of research on the topic that I want to cover.
Hmm.
I do a lot of research on the person who I think is the best fit to help me answer questions around that topic.
Hmm.
And then I just let it be a conversation. I want to pick their brain. I want to share my own experiences as well, because sometimes when I talk about my experiences, it triggers something in the guest and they're like, oh, yeah. And they can continue giving more information and giving more value. And it also lets me pull in any questions that I see coming through, because most of the interviews I'm doing are in a live environment. So I can see questions
Hmm.
coming through from, viewers or listeners who are contributing to the conversation. So I think it gives a lot of flexibility and it makes it a more pleasant experience for both me and for my guest.
Yeah, I think for me, what I found the same thing. I find that if I can get maybe 5 or 6 questions and I can send those to the guest ahead of time, it helps
Hmm.
lubricate them a little bit, make them more fluent, make more comfortable, right? Especially if
Yeah.
they've never done interviews before. You and I have done interviews before. We're pretty comfortable on camera and chatting with each other. But a lot of times my guests on this podcast or the other podcast that I do aren't super fluent in doing interviews and talking with an interviewer. And so if I can set maybe 5 questions and I tell them these are questions that we may talk about, just so it
Yeah.
kind of gives them an idea of what the conversation flow may go, because if they don't know and they're not used to doing interviews, they may be nervous and kind of clam up. And you were talking about how you've interviewed people and they just do like short 1-word answers, like it's just kind of like yes,
Yes.
no. And so as an interviewer, that's really hard when they just do a quick answer. Do you have any tips for how to get people to keep talking and when they just say yes, no, maybe?
One of the best ways to at least maybe not fully avoid this, but be ready to deal with it is extend out the tech check. So, if you're doing an interview and you're doing it in the world of video, I hope that you are doing some kind of tech check where you're testing out people's audio and camera and all of all the things that make the show look and sound its best, right? But if you use some of that time to just chat with your guest casually before you go live or you start recording, you're going to understand pretty quickly if how nervous they are,
Mm,
or if they're the kind of person that is very there's just some people who are just very curt, right? Like the answer is yes, and that's that's the answer. That's fine, but you will immediately identify that
hmm.
in that time that you're chatting with them. And so you could even say to them in that before recording time, hey, this is my style. I really want it to be much more of a conversation. Please feel free to just, share stories and
Hmm.
examples. You can get a little off topic. You can get, you can dive deeper into these tangents. I'm not looking for any kind of one word, official answers. So you could call it out if you think that it might go that way. Or if you think it's being caused because they're nervous, having that conversation up front and making it feel like it's a friendly, encouraging space is going to help avoid that in the
Hmm.
interview itself. And if it does happen, I think we're also afraid of these moments of silence. And I actually think the moments of silence are not necessarily always a bad thing. So
Hmm.
just, accept that and be like, oh, great. Maybe I laugh. That's my kind of my
Hmm.
defense mechanism, right? So I might like laugh at that and be like, all right, great answer. Next question,
Yeah.
move to something else, but you roll with it as best as you can. But I do think that the kind of friendly conversation before you start recording and setting expectations in that time is really important. Like what you do by sending the
Hmm.
questions in advance, you can also do or follow up on in that, however much time you have before you actually begin the show.
Well, and I think having those questions also helps too, because again, if I get to the point where I don't really know what to ask next, I can always look up and say, oh, that's one of the questions that I had thought about doing. So let's go
Yeah.
with that. And as far as the other things that I think too is asking open-ended questions. So questions that are hard that you really can't just do a yes or no question to,
Yep.
or if you are asking a yes or no question and they do answer yes or no, you could ask them to expound on that. Say, tell me more about that. And that kind
Mhm.
of forces them to expound on their answer, if you will.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
So you'd mentioned that you do some preparation ahead of time for your interviews. Then that's great. I love that because a lot of times if you don't have any preparation, yeah, that can be a
It
problem.
shows. Yeah.
Yes, it shows.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Mr. Moderator says hi. So,
Hey,
uh,
Paul.
uh, what are some things that you do to prepare not only for the topic but also for the guest? Like, how do you prepare that?
So I might actually be a little bit so I'm interested to hear how strange I am in my process because I think that a lot of people will research the guest, right? So it's you'll go back to their website. If they have a podcast, you're going to listen to a few episodes of their podcast. You're going to kind of get a good feel of who they are, how they sound, what their level of specialty is. For most of what I'm doing, I'm actually thinking topic first, and then I'm going through
Mm,
kind of my mental Rolodex, if you know what that is. I'm going through my mental list of like who do I know well in my sphere of influence that would be a really great person to talk about this topic. So I'm thinking about it as topic first, and then like what kind of answers I want to be able to get to my audience. So in many cases, I know the guest really, really
okay.
well because I have selected them based on my experience with them, and it's that experience with them that I know will help them answer those questions for my audience.
Okay.
So I actually don't need to do a ton of research on them because I know who they are. Like
Sure.
for example, we have Cassie Tucker coming on the flow this upcoming Tuesday, right? I spent a bunch of time with her when I was at Momentum. I've been kind of listening and watching her shows and some of the content she creates. I follow her on a number of the social platforms, so I know that she's like a marketing genius, right? So,
Sure.
so if I'm thinking through and I'm like, okay, well, I really want to do an episode on how to best market your podcast. I'm going through my list of people, and I'm like, well, I just hung out with Cassie at Momentum. So we were like chatting face to face. I know her presentation was on, how to be better marketers for like live shows and for podcasts. So I know that she'll be able to speak to that content. I've heard her speak to that content before. So I don't need to go back and like listen to some of those episodes or kind of refresh myself on that because I know that she's the best fit for
Mhm.
that. I have a lot of luxury, like in that I go out to a lot of events and I spend a lot of time with other creators and marketing professionals and people who are kind of in the topics that
Mhm.
I care about. So it's pretty. I never have an issue finding a guest. It's pretty easy for me to go through my list of people and be like, "Yep, that would be a good fit." And again, I have a relationship with them, so then it's also easier when it comes to the conversation piece.
Well, and they're more comfortable with you then because they have that conversation ahead of time. I mean, they know you, and that's where I think if you're doing an interview with a guest that you're not necessarily familiar with, you especially do that. I mean, tech check, yes, because for tech, but during that time, you do what we did. We talk and kind of talk a little bit about the questions we may talk about, and kind of just get a sense for. I keep using the word flow, but
Thank you.
which is your other podcast. But
Yeah.
the idea of how it's going to flow, and you get that kind of warmed up and conversation going ahead of time, so it's not just a cold come in, get going, and then yeah, you really know the person. So I find for me, like a lot of our guests on the podcast are people that I do know, either
Mhm.
me or my co-host, and then or if I don't know, because we get pitches all the time. I mean, I think anyone who does podcasts get pitches, and half the time it's ones that I have to filter out because they're ones that they have not done they've not done research on us
Yeah, exactly.
to
Yeah, they don't know what
to know what the
what show
show
they're
is
going
like.
on. Yeah.
But I think for the other ones, I do research on them. I'm going to their
Yeah.
website. I'm
Yeah.
like you said, I'm listening to podcasts that they're on. I try to get some questions too that may not be ones that they've ever been asked before,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that is memorable. Then, and then sometimes that's hard. I mean, you have to sometimes have to do a lot of
Yeah.
research on them
Yeah.
to get to the point where you're finding out that question that they may not have been asked before. But I find that helps to kind of make the flow go better with the show because then you have that information of them. You're not just coming in cold. Yeah. So that's one of the things that helps me.
Mm-hmm.
What
Yeah,
happened? Go ahead.
I think you're right. I do want to say, and it's interesting. So, Doc, who is my co-host on The Flow, and I work closely with him at Ecamm, he always says that he's always like on the kind of hunt for the question that they haven't been asked before. I almost I don't I don't tend to worry as much about that, and maybe I'm wrong. I would just like to admit this
Hmm.
because I think that most of the people who I have on the shows that I'm doing are people who our audience my audience doesn't know all that
Okay.
well in that particular context. So in my mind, I don't mind as much if they are going to be answering the questions that maybe they have a lot of content on already on their own show or as other interview guests, because it feels pretty unlikely to me that my audience like is a giant fan of theirs and is kind of following them in all these different places. Like I actually want the content that they're best at. I mean,
Okay.
I care less obviously about like if it's um their I guess their bio and stuff like that, where I can include that kind of in the marketing around
Hmm.
it, but the actual like answers that they're providing. But I could be wrong in that. I just been thinking a lot about that because Doc has been saying that a lot, and I'm like, I don't know how much that actually matters to me and to what I'm doing, but it is I mean, I think in certain instances it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think to your point, I think that if they're comfortable with the set of questions that they've been asked maybe 2 or 3 times, they're going to be better at
They're gonna
saying,
nail that
yeah,
answer.
they're gonna say
Yeah.
it, they're gonna know it offhand, as opposed to have to think and maybe do a lot of dead spots. I don't do a whole lot of
Yeah.
editing for my podcast, right? And
Yeah.
I'm a whole big fan of the live to tape, live, doing live video interviews, live, I do the live stuff. And so for me, I don't do editing. And so for me, if someone has to take 30 seconds to think of the answer to the question, that's going to make the show sound less professional and less, yeah,
Yeah.
that I might have to go back and do more editing on to kind of cut those spaces down. And so I think you are right, is if you're going to be able to get those questions that people that they've already answered and they know and can prepare for, they're going to be better. And that brings back to a point I heard you say on the flow on the episode about interviewing that you don't like the pop quiz questions. And so
I personally hate the pop quiz questions because and I actually also don't like getting questions in advance, like as an interview guest, because again, I am a dreadful
mhm,
overthinker. And I'm also really like I care about the value that I'm
mhm.
bringing as an interview guest. And so often I feel like there's a gotcha about this. Doc and and I did like a whole episode on this a couple years back on the flow where it was one of those like games where it was like say the first thing that comes to your mind. So it was a similar kind of notion
Mhm.
as the pop questions. And I just fully like my body just shuts down in those
Which is
moments.
why
Like
I won't ask you any of the questions that I
you
have
could.
here.
I'll
So,
just stare
you know.
Yeah, I'll just stare blankly at you. I mean, if it's like an easy one, like if it's like, like red or blue or whatever,
Mhm.
like I can answer those kinds of things, but I always feel like a lot of those questions are like, what's your like top marketing tip? And I'm like, I don't like I wasn't prepared for that, or I just can't I don't know. And then I feel it's
Right.
that panic in that moment of like, I don't want to sound stupid. And I also don't want to give bad advice to someone. And I'm not capable of thinking that quickly on my toes and being able to provide value.
Right.
So
And
yeah,
so for me, that's one of the things. Don't worry, I don't do that on this show. It's on one of my other ones
it's
that we
fine.
do that. But
It's fine.
but I always try to make them feel comfortable too. Before we start recording, I say this is, we are live streaming,
Yeah.
and I don't do a whole lot of editing. However, if you say something that you feel uncomfortable with, or you don't, later think, shoot, I shouldn't have said that, I
Yeah.
say, let me know, and I will edit that out. And so
Yeah.
I try to make people feel a little bit more comfortable and less like stupid, if you will, for having to stumble over their words and over their thoughts because they are not familiar with it. But
Yeah.
so how would you handle that? So like, I would assume, hopefully, that if you were, I mean, as an interviewee, maybe we can talk about some tips with that too.
Yeah.
Somebody who's being interviewed, would you go and listen to the show? So like, if I invited you on my other podcast, would you listen to the show first so that you may know, hey, we do these pop quiz questions every time, and would you feel comfortable telling the host, I'm not so comfortable with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a total people pleaser, so I probably wouldn't admit like that. That was just between us publicly on my other show. But I would definitely, if I'm able to make the time that week, I definitely try to listen to at least part of the show, so I have a good idea of of what the
Mhm.
content is like and what to expect. I probably would just suck it up and do my best to work my way
Hmm.
through it. I probably wouldn't admit or ask for a change. And I will say that like I have certainly been on a number of shows where people send the questions in advance. And I what that does and why I don't like that particular aspect personally is that it gives me a lot of time to go back into that place in my brain where I like think through the exact perfect quote
Mm.
unquote answer, and I like write that down so that I like don't forget that answer. And then when I'm actually in the interview, I'm like never pleased with how I actually phrased it because I want to just read the answer as I wrote it down. So it just gives me that opportunity to overthink and to I think come across much more like rigid and less myself and probably not actually help the person on
Mm.
the other
Hmm.
side. It just gives me that opportunity to be a total perfectionist about it and really just want to answer once I've given it all that thought. But once I've given it all that thought, I've written out the perfect answer the way I want it and I just want to read it. And
Yeah.
there's no
and,
opportunity to do that.
and I like conversations that are more of are interviews that are more of conversations. So
Yeah.
again, if you have the questions written out, you find that, like you had said earlier, you end up having to force
Yeah, it's the
yourself into those
same
questions, right?
same issue on both sides of the coin. Yep.
Right, you end
Yep.
up having to it's less of a conversation because you're going, oh well, I need to get this and this and this, and
Yep.
it may not flow, and that's going to sound weird to the people listening because it's going to sound like you had an agenda that you had to get out, and
Yeah.
and yeah, and it took
Yep.
you may have taken where it didn't even need to go. And I think it's important too to listen to what your interviewee is saying too. So you ask a question as an interviewer, it's important to listen and not necessarily be thinking of what our next question is going to be. And so
Yeah.
that's where having some prepared questions can help, because if you get to the point where because you're listening to the conversation because you're a good listener, you may not have that next question in your mind. So it may be easy to go, okay, I'm gonna look at the next question and say it. But yeah, I think it's a conversation is better to go uh to just be able to have that conversation. As Paul says, the answers can come across as scripted then too.
They in my case they literally are.
Yeah.
The answers are literally scripted. I should say actually on that note, you reminded me of I guess like an extension of my previous answer when you're so I do a few different shows. I do a show called Meet the Ecamm Fam, which Andy's been
Yep.
on, where I interview customers from from all different kinds of backgrounds and at all different skill sets, and brand new customers and people who've been with the brand for a long time. And that show is the opposite of everything I said previously, where I have no control over who's signing up for it because it's open and
Mm.
available to anyone. Anyone can sign up for it. And what I've done there to give myself some more time back and to kind of make it an easier experience as an interviewer is I have them fill out like a pretty no, I guess not super detailed, but a detailed questionnaire where I directly ask people like what do you want to talk about in,
Mm.
in this show, like what are the things that are important to you, and I always like read through that carefully and reference that. And so from that perspective, it's like less about who they are as an expert and more about what like why did they want to come on as a guest, why did they decide to do this, and what is it that they want to share, and how can I facilitate that conversation. So it's a different level of research where it actually doesn't matter as much, at least I don't think, going back and like researching them inside and out. I think it actually matters more on like really reading through and understanding what the intention was behind why they want to be on the show and what it is that's important to them that that they would like to share and to get out. And if I can get to that, those are the episodes that are the best and the ones that I want to repurpose, and they make I think the most effective kind of case studies of how people are using the software and what's really valuable to them. So it's a different kind of research, but again,
Mhm.
it saves me a bunch of time. That upfront step of asking for that information saves me a ton of research time where I would have to be like, digging through a whole bunch of stuff to figure out like why and and what makes them interesting or special or unique to be able to share their story with the rest of our audience.
Well, and I think that gives you the opportunity, because that is a different a different style, if you will,
Hmm.
to most shows. Or most shows, you're saying this is the topic we're going to talk about, and
Yep.
this person knows a
Yeah.
lot about the topic, so you're focused a lot on the topic. Whereas Meet the Ecamm fam, it really is like you're just
It's the
meeting
person.
them.
Yeah.
So it's like you're
Yep.
sitting down for coffee, and they're saying, "Hey, this is what I'm passionate about," and you just digging in more about more digging in and trying to find more information about that person to get to know them better. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that's a good point there. So what happens if you have like blunders, like where like how would you like if you stumble on your question, or you can't think of a question, or what would some advice be that you can give for that, where you just kind of as an interviewer freeze or say something stupid, or like how do you handle that?
That's a really, really, it's a great question, and it's a really complicated answer because the unfortunate reality is that you're just going to have to survive it, and the only way that you get better at that and better at dealing with it and better at not doing it is by practicing. And so I guess I go back to my first answer which is like you have full control over over what your content is, over how you present yourself, over the guests that you bring on. And so give yourself a break, like
Hmm.
set yourself up for success for the first 20 episodes, however many episodes. Bring on people like and trust, people that are going to cover you if you have moments where you feel nervous, or you have things that go
Hmm.
dreadfully wrong at like. And also I've gotten really confident and capable because I also have, you mentioned Paul earlier, right? Like
Hmm.
I have friends and contacts and people who are also in the chat. So,
Hmm.
they're the first people that will point out, like, hey, there's an audio problem, or having people around you that can highlight what's going wrong and help you to solve it quickly is going to make you feel more comfortable going through it, and staying calm is going to help you get better at figuring out the ways to troubleshoot and to solve it. There's no way to practice it. There's no way to fake it. You've just kind of got to experience it. And
Hmm.
so in order to experience it, put safe people around you so that you're experiencing it not
Sure.
alone, and you're experiencing it where you can get immediate help, and it won't feel as awful, right?
Hmm.
Like if you have like a really, I don't know, like a celebrity or someone that's like a really big deal in the industry that you're in, coming onto your show, like I would hope that you have done a ton of episodes and practice work beforehand with people that
Hmm.
you trust, so that you will have a level of confidence and you'll know what to do if something goes wrong on the one that really, really, gets you the most nervous or feels
Hmm.
the biggest to you.
And I think that happens. I've been podcasting since 2007, and there are still people that I have on that make me nervous, especially if they're more well-known people, because it feels
Yeah.
it shouldn't, but it feels bigger to me,
It
right?
does. Yeah.
It really shouldn't. It shouldn't feel any bigger different, but it does.
Yeah,
And
it does though. Yeah, I hear you.
and I like your idea of practicing with people, and you can do that several different ways. You can just record, right? Like beforehand, we are live streaming this episode, but you don't have to. You can just record and get used to asking the questions. If you wanted to, you could go. I mean, everybody who has a Google account has a YouTube account too that they can stream to
Hmm.
if they want to, and doesn't have to be your show channel. It can be just your personal channel, and
Yep.
get some time in with the live streaming too, so you get comfortable with the idea that this is live and there may be people watching, because that feels different too, right? It does when you're
Yeah.
live. It feels different. So do you do you
And
have?
there's no way there's no way to like, unfortunately there's no way to practice without doing it. Like I
Hmm.
was having a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who has been podcasting for a little bit and is seeing a ton of success, and this was her first foray into, like, maybe I could live stream this interview episode as part of my podcast as kind of a special event. And she is and was absolutely incredible, because I basically said to her, she was like, "What advice do you have for me?" And I was like, "I think you need to go live, like,
Hmm.
before your interview later, and you need to just go, like, do a live tech check." And I'm like, "You can do it as a recorded tech check. You can do it as, a live only to unlisted or what have you. But if you want to actually have the full experience, including the feelings and nerves that you're going
Hmm.
to have, you should just go live and just go on and be like, hey, I'm testing all this out. Likely a few things are going to go wrong. Like, help me test, drop comments in, be just really honest about it. And I was blown away because most people, and probably including myself, even a few years back, would have been like, I'm not going to do that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to do, great idea, Katie. I'm going to, I'm going to take that and then I'm going to just record a video and make sure everything sounds great. But she did. She went and she tested and she caught a few issues and but it gave her those reps in the experience that she was actually trying to have. So if you are live streaming, you need to practice by live streaming. If you are interviewing, you have to practice by interviewing. You have to put yourself into that situation because otherwise you could have a really flawless recorded tech check. And the issue that you have is like internet connectivity or, or how a guest joins or a comment that doesn't show up correctly or whatever else that you didn't get to practice because you didn't practice in the way you're actually going to be creating the content.
Well, and I find too that people like to see behind the scenes too, right? And so even if you're doing that on your show, channel, whatever, they like seeing that being real. They like
no one's gonna hate you for it. Like if you come on and you're like, I'm just testing, nothing to see here. Like they either hang out or they don't.
Right. And it's not gonna make your show less professional, right? They like to see that. They like to know that people are real people. And so I 100% agree. Do it, test it live. So now you've done lots and lots and lots of interviews. Do you have any tips or tricks that I've not brought up yet?
Oh my gosh. See, these are one of these questions where I'm like going through my head to make sure I'm adding a ton of value. I mean, I think again, like if you are going to be an interviewer, that you need to be an interviewee first. So, go and experience what that's like to be on the other side and then take all of that information and use it to build out a really like seamless experience for your guests, because if it's not, it makes the entire experience worse for you and for your viewers, right? So I've been like lucky enough to be a guest on a number of different kinds of shows. I say yes to almost every single one that I get,
well,
which
you
I'm
for saying yes
proud
to
of, and I will. Well, no, of course, but I'm proud of, and I will hold on to that because I think sometimes we're like, oh, well, like I'm very important and very busy, and I only have time to do like these shows that are like at this level or above. But you will learn from every style of show and every level of show, and people who are, have a really small audience and people who have a really big audience. And you'll be able to pull all of those things that you liked into an experience that makes your show and your process special and a great experience. So like, shout out to Kirk Nugent. I think I use him as an example every time we talk about interviewing, but he has like in my mind, flawless guest experience. Like he has like a really great automated process. He's very clear with he's super clear with everything. Like he tells you in advance, like exactly how long the episode is going to be, what the segments are, like what the format is going to be, what he's expecting to get out of it, what his viewers are expecting to get out of it, how you join, when the tech check is. Like he walks you through that process, but in a way that doesn't feel too big or too overwhelming. Like it's just this really nice sequence of like, hey, here's what you can expect as you go through this experience. And what I really loved the most about all of it is he's probably one of the only people that tells you exactly the amount of time and he sticks to it. And so for me, like when I join his show and the shows that I've been on for him in the past have been in the evenings. I have little kids and I'm pretty like that evening tends to be the time where like I don't do a lot of stuff because I want that time to myself. But he's like, hey, you're going to join at like 7 p.m. We're going to go until 7:35 p.m. And then we're going to do like 10 minutes of questions and then you're gone. Like, I do not expect you to stay. You peace out and I continue on.
Nice.
And I love that because I know like this is the amount of time I have to block off versus some other ones where it's like, I assume I'm going to be on for an hour because I always seem to be on for an hour. And like, there's also moments as a guest where like and I'm bad even at doing this as an interviewer, but like where the show ends and you're like, do I stay on and we chat? Do I like just like hang up? Do I like, you don't really know what you're supposed to do. You don't want to offend anyone. So he's clear with all of that, which I think is great.
I think that's a great thing to keep in mind because I think I forget that too, especially in
same all the time.
Right, where we have people who like maybe not listening to the show, so they don't know what exactly to expect. And so
Yeah.
I think that's one of those things where if you know as a guest how long to be there, and it's interesting because I think on my other show we do some in person interviews and we do some
Yeah.
remote, and so that experience is different too because
100%.
like you said, and I found Ecamm does the nice fade out. I mean, I know you can turn that off to fade to black when you stop, but we've had
Yeah.
people that hang up as soon as that happens. And,
Yeah.
and it's like, no, I wanted to like just thank you real quickly for the show. So we got to the point where we said, once this is done, like we do it beforehand, but like once this is done and we quit the show, just stay on for just
Hang
a
in
few
there.
seconds.
Yeah.
Just hang out and then
Yeah.
we'll let you go. But yeah, yeah, those are really, really great tips. Any other tips that you can give us quickly?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm sort of on this, if you've seen me or hang out with me in any of my other content, I'm on this like journey, for lack of a better word, this year of trying really hard to simplify things and to just get a little bit better every single time.
Okay.
And so I think when it comes to guest stuff, again, like you're going to learn something every single time you do it. So just, like take a note. And if you're like me and you overcomplicate things, like, just be always asking yourself, like, and ask your guests on the other side of the interview, if they stick around and you're able to hang out with them, like, how could I have made this experience better? What is one thing that you like loved about being on this interview? How was the process? Like, just be constantly kind of getting that feedback and see if you can make tweaks to make the experience easier on yourself, maybe a little bit more simplified and a better overall experience for your guests. So, and figure out like what are those different changes that you can make. Like one we're doing right now is so I'm doing a show survey for Ecamm to figure out like which of our shows how are they all performing? How do people like
Sure.
them? What do they like or not like about each of the shows? And then at the same time, Paul is helping me build out better calendars, because that's been a huge pain point for us this year, is that we have like a lot of shows and we have different ways people can sign up. And I feel like I'm constantly losing the information, or I'm not asking the right questions, or like I haven't figured out or unlocked that workflow. So it's, again, I think there's, just because you're in a particular format or you've convinced yourself that there's a particular way you should be doing things does not mean you can't make a change. So go and be a guest on other people's shows. Ask your guests what their experience is like on your show and figure out how you can continually make it a little bit better or make it easier and save yourself time and hassle. So that's been my big thing. And I think that applies obviously to anything, but certainly in the world of interviewing.
Awesome. Well, Katie, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. I realized I didn't tell you how long to expect.
No, you're sorry. No, I wasn't meaning to call you out. You're good. I block off an hour for all of these things. So
yeah, thank you guys so much. If you have any podcasting questions, feel free to go to podcastanswers.com/contact. I'd love to work with new podcasters, getting them set up. Thanks again, Katie, for being on the show.
my pleasure. See you next time.